as we are getting close to the end of the third week of Season 3, we are approaching right today and tomorrow in EU week 4, we are getting our recap of the situation in the raid, especially with the added set of balance tuning to the specs and classes coming right at the beginning of this next reset. We have buffs to a few specs like Unholy DK, like Devastation Evoker. We also have nerfs to a bunch of other specs. Havoc, Beast Mastery, Assassination, are all specs getting nerfed. So with this recap, we have the snapshot of the situation right before we get to see the impact of these changes, these buffs and these nerfs to the specs, starting from the raid first. Now, what is the more relevant thing when looking at the raid situation week by week, right, as the guilds are still progressing, is of course that the more you go deep into a raid, the more you get different results based on the bosses you are killing, right? Because if you try to guess, if you try to analyze the meta of the raid, the strong specs in the raid in week 1, then most of the logs on week 1 will be from Nullroot and from maybe Igira and maybe Volkoros, right? So there are not going to be that many other guilds killing any more bosses. So most of what you will see essentially won't be the meta of the raid, the meta of the strongest specs in the raid, but just of the ones in the first few bosses. And then you go into week 2, and now you have a few more specs logging, for example, Council. And Council might have, for example, completely different rankings than Volkoros. You know, you ended week 1 looking at the situation with Volkoros and you're like, wow, Assassination is totally OP, and then the week after you go and look at Council and it's just Balanced Druid and some Elemental Shaman. The deeper you go into the raid, the more you see the performance of the specs boss by boss. This week we have started, for example, to see more logs of Smolderon, as more of the Smolderon kills have gone through this week. We went from the 20-something kills of Smolderon, now we have 160 almost, right? So now we have even more results of that boss as well. So the results are, of course, that still the 3 specs at the top are the 3 specs that are going to get nerfed right on this reset. Assassination, Beast Mastery and Havoc are all about to be somewhat weaker after the balance tuning hitting on this coming reset. We still have, finally, the still big misunderstanding of the situation with Marksmanship Hunter, which still shows up as the 4th best DPS spec in the raid. Now, if you look at the popularity, you will see that there is a grand total of 333 Marksmanship Hunters actually logged in the raid compared to the 24,000 Beast Mastery Hunters. So this number is more or less ignorable as far as the performance of Marksmanship. What is perhaps slightly less ignorable, even though the number is still quite small, is the number of Subtlety. Subtlety is still underplayed and still not popular at all, but they are here for a more relevant reason. The more relevant reason is what we checked on the bosses, and this time, as we mentioned, was Smolderon, the results of the best performing specs on the boss. And you can see that actually, while Marksmanship is still not here and the Hunters are still playing BM, for Rogues, for this fight, it is actually Subtlety, the spec that gets the most play from Rogues on Smolderon, which is quite a difficult, quite a hard boss, and Subtlety is doing very well. That's also one of the reasons why Subtlety is showing up much better now in this recap of the raid compared to the ones on the week and the weeks before this one. With the more logs coming through, as we mentioned, with the more logs coming through of Council, we also have better overall compared to last week results of both Balanced Druid, which was lower down, and Elemental, which was lower down, thanks to their power on a cleave split fight on Council. They get to log quite highly on this boss. If we go straight to just looking at Council itself, you see how much it can skew the performance of just these 2 specs. So you have to keep in mind that if they get to be so high on Council, then if you go back to something like Volkoros, balance is much lower down. If you go to something like Larodak, you can also see balance still quite lower down. So the results, you know, have to be kept in mind depending on the performance on each boss. Meanwhile, when it comes to other specs, it's not that they change their performance that much depending on the boss. Like, for example, we currently have all 3 mage specs still towards the bottom and not doing that well. Same goes for the 2 DK specs, as well as Shadow Priest, Red Paladin, both of the Evoker specs, and Windwalker Monk. Now, across these specs, we also do have some of them being buffed, right? On this reset, we have Devastation being buffed, we have Unholy Death Knight being buffed, but there's also something worth mentioning, which is Augmentation. Because, of course, the difference across all of these specs is that while these specs are weak, they're also not particularly popular, right? You have the mage specs barely in the middle of the pack, same goes for Unholy DK, you also have Devastation being quite low, and even Shadow Priest and in the middle of the pack. But then you have Augmentation, very high up, right? And the performance shows off as awful. Now, the disclaimer for Augmentation is that they are not nearly as bad as the logs might suggest, because we are now back in a similar situation that Augmentation had in 10.1.7, which is their logs are back to having problems counting damage and attributing damage to Augmentation. For example, you now have multiple abilities currently bugged and not giving the damage back to the Augmentation Evoker correctly. You can find multiple parts of each of the classes' toolkits that don't actually reflect the damage back to an Augmentation Evoker. So they're not really that terrible. Now, even if the damage was fully attributed to Augmentation, they will still be somewhere in the average middle of the pack. We're not talking about them being secretly hidden OP, even if their damage was fully counted, but at the same time not nearly as bad as this level of ranking would suggest for Augmentation. What we can see though when it comes to the raid is that we are definitely in a caster unfriendly meta, in a caster unfriendly season, right? If you look at the top performers, the only actual typical spellcaster that makes it as a spec is Demonology Warlock, and that is barely. Most of the other specs in your average composition are gonna be Rogue. Multiple specs of Rogue are worth. You have Beast Mastery Hunter, you have Enhancement Shaman, you have Havoc Demon Hunter, perhaps you have some Warriors, which make up the bulk of your raid composition. And the casters, you know, the Augmentation Evoker, the Devastation, all 3 of the mage specs, the Shadow Priest, Affliction, Destruction, Balanced Druid, and Elemental Shaman are all not very present in your compositions. Even if we look at the top results, the top performances of the top guilds, for example, looking at the current boss progressed by most guilds being Tindral, you can even see by the actual numbers, right? You can see how many green percentages of melee DPS are available for this boss compared to the ranged. All of your traditional casters are in the deep red, and then you have Beast Mastery, which is effectively a melee in disguise, a melee that pretends to be a ranged, and Augmentation. The situation is even so bad for something like a Balanced Druid that every Balanced Druid, if they want to play Tindral, has to respec to Feral. That's how dire the situation is at the moment for casters in the raid. Even regardless of their actual performance, the majority of the comps are now featuring and orbiting around a more melee-heavy composition compared to what we might have been used to in previous tiers. Still, regardless of the performance, you know, if you were to look at this and you're like, I don't get it, you know, Demonology has 201,000 average DPS in the raid, it's even higher than BM, it's even higher than Warrior, than Enhancement, why can't we bring more Warlocks, right? Right now, you have the situation where you bring just one Warlock for the Hellstones and the Gateway, you just bring one Mage for the Arcane Intellect, and then once you're done bringing those 2, you fill the rest with melee DPS and with a couple of Beast Mastery Hunters and Augmentation Evokers. We will see, of course, if the nerfs to the top performers and the buffs to a few of the ones at the bottom will change this status quo when it comes to DPS in the raid. We can also check for a bit the healing, because what we do also have is a nerf to Mistweaver Monk, right? We mentioned the DPS specs being buffed or nerfed, but then also one of the more relevant changes for healers is the nerf to Mistweaver Monk, the smaller nerf to Discipline Priest, and the buff to Holy Priest. So in terms of results in the raid, you still have the weird thing, almost similar to the Marksmanship Hunter doing super well in the general results for DPS, of Resto Shaman being quite high in overall healing, despite being the lowest in participation, in popularity in the raid. This one is being nerfed, this one is being nerfed, and then this one all the way down here is being buffed. These are the changes coming in the next reset. You can see the overall results, right? You can see the general idea of a Mistweaver Monk being roughly 10, 12, 13% ahead in healing compared to all of the other specs in the middle. And then you have the same in reverse of Holy Priest, which is 10, 12, 13% behind in healing all of the specs in the middle. So these nerfs are essentially trying to squeeze the gaps from the top to the middle and from the bottom to the middle when it comes to the performance of healers in the raid. It still won't really change much because the style of healing of a Holy Priest is still much more similar to the style of a Mistweaver Monk than it is to the one of a Discipline Priest. So if you already had a Mistweaver Monk in your raid, you will still be playing a Mistweaver Monk after the nerf over a Holy Priest, and you won't swap your Discipline Priest back to Holy just because Discipline is nerfed and Holy is buffed, because of the much different way in how they heal and how Discipline is more valuable to your raid. If you already have a throughput, HPS, constant healing type of spec like Mistweaver, or a Resto Shaman, or a Resto Druid, or even a Holy Paladin, at the moment all stronger than Holy Priest. It is still at the very least a start in terms of buffs to a Holy Priest. Now we can finish the weekly recap to the raid going in the laughingstock corner, which is the specs and their deaths in the raid. Because of course with more guilds progressing through more bosses, we might see changes in where do the specs die the most. A particular very difficult boss for quite a few specs to survive is, for example, going to be Smolderon, that now more guilds have progressed through. So in our deaths for this week, we do see still a few of the fan favorites being very high in deaths, like Marksmanship, like Balanced Druid, Arms Warrior, much like last week, very much higher than Fury for whatever reason. Arms seems to be much more prone to killing themselves in raids compared to their Fury counterpart. And then you have the other outlier. When you look at healers, you see Preservation, Holy Paladin, Resto Druid, Holy Priest, Mistweaver, and then all the way at the top, you see Discipline. Discipline has been a particular death candidate for a boss like Smolderon, where they are required to ramp and to do their whole rotation in the middle of a barrage of flames swirling around, and trying to stay alive there for a more immobile spec is much harder. So you have Discipline rising up in the rankings. You also have a few other cute differences, like Assassination dying way more often than Outlaw, for example, while Feral didn't want to make Balance feel alone at the top as a Druid spec, so they joined them together in the top of most deaths, something that Warlocks aren't doing. Warlocks are, as usual, always towards the bottom as one of the tankier DPS specs. These are the results as far as deaths go. No surprises, of course, that all of the tanks basically are the least likely to die during a pull in the raid. So these are our results so far by the end of week 3 of the raid, as we enter week 4. It's also an interesting thing to point out that now we are getting not all of them, but the majority of these specs in Mythic progression with their 4-piece set bonus. By this point, we now have at least 2 Catalyst charges plus 1 meta achievement, ahead of the curve achievement token for your raid tier. So basically everyone here at least has 3, which means all they needed is just one tier piece in 3 resets. So we can now assume, unlike the first couple of weeks, now we can assume that every one of these specs performing are doing so finally with their 4-piece set bonus, so their full power of the season available So it's also a more relevant performance compared to what we checked in the first weeks of the season. So for today, right before the balance tuning goes live at the beginning of this new reset, this is the situation as far as the raid performance is concerned. With this out of the way, I'm going to leave you to your own conclusions about what this might mean for the raid performances. So let me guys know if you have something in mind, especially after seeing the tuning that is gonna come right on this reset, if something might be changing in terms of results in the raid. But for now, on this Tuesday, we are going to leave each other once again. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, as well as everyone tuning in on the stream, on the evenings, whenever it's on, as well as everyone who does it for free by, for example, liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, man, it's gotten so cold in just a few days. It went from like 10, 12 degrees, and then you wake up the day after and it's -2. What the hell?